Might begin by asking, well, why would we be interested in analytic induction? I think it is of some historical interest because it was quite influential in the 1930s and 40s in American sociology, associated with the Chicago School. It's not as influential today, I would say. But there is still quite a lot of reference to it. I was quite surprised. I did a little search to see what I could find, and I found actually more references to it in textbooks and other places than I'd expected to find. But I think for me the most important, the most interesting thing about it actually is the issues that it raises about how we go about social scientific work, social scientific analysis, particularly in the context of qualitative work, but not only that. So if we start with a historical sketch, I think the first place where you find a reference to analytic induction, of course, this may not be, I'm sure somebody is going to find that there's one further back, but as far as I know, the first appearance is in a book called The Method of Sociology by Florian Znaniewski, who was a Polish sociologist who ended up in Chicago and worked in Chicago for a short time in the late 1920s or early 1930s. Znaniewski actually by training was a philosopher. So what you find is that he is drawing on quite a lot of philosophical knowledge. He's not very explicit about what he's drawing on, but I think if you look at what he says, you can find traces of ideas about scientific method that you would find in Aristotle, but also in John Stuart Mill. And I mentioned John Stuart Mill and Aristotle because they take somewhat different approaches, but you can find elements of both in Znaniewski's account. There is in Znaniewski's work, there is at least one example he provides. It's not that easy to follow. He wasn't really he was more interested in theoretical ideas than he was in empirical research. He was involved in empirical research, but if you want an example, a classic example of this kind of approach, then the first places you would find it would be Alfred Lindersmith's work on opiate addiction, Donald Cressy on financial trust violation, and Howard Becker on marijuana use. Interestingly, I don't think Lindersmith refers to Znaniewski by name, but I'm sure was aware of Znaniewski's work. I've got to put some more recent examples in there. The references are at the back, just to show that it is other people have appealed to it more recently. So what is analytic induction? Well, as I say, it's a distinctive conception of the proper form of scientific method. It was put forward by Znaniewski explicitly in opposition to statistical method. Statistical method was on the rise at the time when Znaniewski was writing. He felt that it couldn't be a scientific method because all it produced were probabilistic statements, and for him, science produces universal laws. So his approach, analytic induction, was designed to produce universal laws. And he thought that that was very important, that goal was very important, not just because that's the nature of scientific knowledge, but also because the crucial growing point for any theory is that you claim that something holds in all circumstances of a particular type. If you find an exception, then you have to revise the theory. Whereas with a probabilistic statement, if you find an exception, you just say, well, that's an exception, the probabilistic law doesn't apply to it. So you've not got that drive for revising your theoretical ideas in the face of empirical evidence. And that was very important for him. That for him was an essential element of scientific method. Basically, analytic induction is about its causal analysis. It's about finding what the causes are of some type of outcome. And what Znaniewski means by causes there is necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. And that's really just another way of saying universal laws. as we'll see, there is some disagreement about the steps of analytic induction, but this seems to me to be the probably the most accurate account of what's involved. You start with some notion of what sort of outcome it is, what type of outcome it is that you're trying to explain. So that in the case of Linda Smith, it was people becoming addicted to opiates. The next step is that you collect data on some cases where the outcome is present. So you collect data on people who are addicted. And your aim is to look at those cases to find what is common to those cases that could be the cause or part of the cause. The notion of cause here can be a combination of different factors. On the basis of what you find shared, you construct a hypothesis. You then collect data on further cases. If you find a case which doesn't fit your hypothesis, then you have two options. You either reformulate the hypothesis or you redefine the phenomenon that you're investigating. And that second option, redefining the phenomenon, is something that is well, I was going to say distinctive to analytic induction. I'm not claiming that no other approach involves it, but it's quite explicit in analytic induction that you have those two options, that actually defining what the phenomenon is, what the outcome is a crucial part of the research process. You can't take it for granted. You can't assume that you already know what the outcome is. You might need to reformulate it. And you continue collecting data until you're no longer finding cases which conflict with your hypothesis. There is no rule for how long you should carry on doing that, but you carry on doing it and you come to some point where you decide, for the moment anyway, this hypothesis seems to fit the data, and therefore you can put it forward tentatively as the explanation for that type of outcome. For those who like diagrams, that's a diagram. It took me a lot of time and effort to try and produce it. So I hope you all appreciate it. But it more or less says the same thing as I've just been saying. But you can see that it is an iterative process. The diagram makes that quite clear. So if we take an example, Donald Cressy is interested, it starts out by interested in embezzlement. Why do people embezzle funds? And he does this by interviewing people who are in prison for offences, either embezzlement itself or other offences that he sees as closely related to embezzlement. In the American law, there are a number of different such offences. And he looks at the factors that they share in common, he develops a hypothesis, he finds some deviant cases. And what he then decides is that what he needs to do is to refine his conception of what it is he's investigating. So he's not just going to modify. There are a number of occasions where he modifies the hypothesis, but he gets to the point where he decides that the problem is more fundamental than that. That you actually need to make a distinction between those people who were in a position of financial trust and met some financial emergency and decided to, quote, borrow money from the pool of money that they were in charge of. You distinguish between that and people who specifically took on a position of financial trust in order to steal. He argued that the factors involved in those two types of case would be very different. So he redefines what he's investigating no longer as embezzlement in that general sense, but what he calls financial trust violation. And he means people who were in positions of financial trust who decide subsequently to borrow money. Okay, well, I've already said that analytic induction was developed as an alternative to statistical inference. It's also clearly an alternative to theoretical speculation, if you like, that in the sense that it is a quite systematic process that involves analysing data. You don't necessarily need to collect the data in the sense of going out and interviewing people or observing, but using data in order to develop and test a theoretical idea. It's also opposed to accounts that are simply descriptive. It's not simply describing some situation in the way in which ethnographers, for example, sometimes argue that what they're doing is providing a description of a situation. It's looking at cases specifically to develop and test a theoretical idea. So if we think about how it compares to some other sorts of influential qualitative approach, how does it differ from grounded theorizing? Well, one difference, I think, is that the focus for analytic induction is much more specific. The interest is in what causes this type of outcome. Whereas grounded theorizing usually has a broader focus. It's interested in the patterns of interaction that go on within a particular type of setting and a set of theoretical concepts which make sense of the interactional processes in that setting. There is some ambiguity in grounded theorizing about whether the aim is to test the theory that's emerging. It's quite explicit in analytic induction that part of the task is to test as well as to develop. The point I mentioned earlier about redefining the phenomenon, I'm sure that occurs when people use grounded theorizing, but it's not made explicit by Glaser and Strauss, or I haven't seen it made explicit by them. Whereas it's very important for both Staniewski and Linda Smith, who are the two people who've written about analytic induction, about it's the science as an approach to social science. Just mentioned that it's quite interesting that analytic induction and grounded theorizing both developed within the realm of what you would call Chicago School of Sociology. Anselm Strauss and Alfred Lindersmith knew one another. They were friends. There is a discussion of analytic induction in Glaser and Strauss's discovery of grounded theory. So there is that connection. But these two sets of ideas seem to have been in parallel rather than being brought together at any particular point. If people know something about qualitative comparative analysis, it's quite interesting to compare analytic induction with that, because as with grounded theorizing, there is much shared in common, but there are also significant differences. Qualitative comparative analysis tends to start with a whole set of cases and is interested in what combinations of factors that can be found in those cases seem to be associated with some type of outcome. And it's quite systematic in looking at all of the different combinations in order to draw a conclusion. It doesn't have the sort of developmental process that is involved in analytic induction, where you first collect some cases, then you develop your hypothesis, then you collect some more, then you revise your hypothesis or redefine the phenomenon, then you collect some more cases. It's not quite the same in that developmental sense, and analytic induction doesn't usually involve the kind of systematic checking of all the different combinations of factors that qualitative comparative analysis does. Okay. Now, one of the things about analytic induction is that if you look at the various accounts of it, there is quite a bit of variation in what people mean by it. And I've listed here some of the differences. Some people argue that its distinctive feature is that the researcher starts with a hypothesis. Now, I find this a bit puzzling, because it seems to me analytic induction usually means that you start with the data rather than start with a hypothesis. So I'm not quite sure how this has arisen, but I think perhaps it's because there is so much emphasis on the idea of hypotheses in analytic induction, and qualitative researchers certainly today tend not to talk about hypotheses. They think of hypotheses being something that is part of quantitative research. So whether that's how it arose, I don't know. Seems to me that it really is inductive in the sense that you start from the data, but the aim is to develop a hypothesis from the data. But you will find some definitions which suggest that it starts from hypotheses. Another big issue is whether it, and much more significant one I would say, is whether it searches for negative cases or whether it examines all the types of case that it needs to examine in order to find necessary and sufficient conditions. The other variation is whether the goal is universal laws. I said at the beginning that that's what Naniewski was aiming at. That's also what Lindersmith is aiming at. Lindersmith wants to know what causes opiate addiction anywhere in the world. He specifically, a lot of his data is about the United States in the 1920s and 30s, but actually he makes quite a lot of effort to get data from other countries as well, because he thinks that he's identifying a universal process, not something that is culturally specific. More recent users of analytic induction, not surprisingly, I suppose, argue that what they're interested in is a more restricted kind of generalization, because the idea that qualitative researchers would be in search of universal laws. I don't think you'd find very many qualitative researchers today who would claim to be searching for universal laws. Okay, well there we've got a quote about analytic induction that starts from a pre-existing theoretical viewpoint or premise that guides the investigator's approach to the cases that are examined. Yeah, that's certainly not the original, that's not the way analytic induction was originally formulated. If we think of Lindersmith and Naniewski as a sort of classic approach, their approach was inductive. More recent approaches, people have redefined the nature of the approach in various ways, including in terms of thinking about that it operates with a prior theory. The second issue, if you remember, was about whether it covers all of the different factors. Analytic induction, when it was first developed, was criticised because most of the cases that, for example, Lindersmith and Cressy used were cases where the phenomenon they were interested in was present. If all of your cases are cases where the outcome is present, then all you're going to identify are those factors which are necessary for the outcome. You're not going to find what's sufficient. In order to find what's sufficient, you have to look at cases where the cause is present, but the outcome is absent, and other things are similar. So you've got to search to find out whether there are such cases. That's the only way that you would be able to discover causes that are sufficient to bring about the outcome. Both Lindersmith and Cressy do that to some extent. They do try to do that, but they don't do it in a very adequate way. So that, for example, the way that Cressy does it is to talk to the people that have carried out embezzlement about their past lives, about situations in which they were within, where they had financial trust, where they might have had some sort of financial emergency, and he looks at that to try and work out what was different about when they actually decided to steal money. But that is certainly a useful thing to do, but arguably it doesn't give you the kind of rigorous analysis of comparative cases that you would require to make the sort of strong claim that he wants to make about a universal law. The other thing that's changed is in terms of the nature of the product. So I think I've already mentioned this, so people now talk about modified analytic induction, and the aim is to produce restricted generalizations or working hypotheses or whatever. I actually think that classic analytic induction is the more interesting version, because it's the one that offers the biggest contrast with what the kind of analysis that most qualitative researchers would do today. It also provides the biggest contrast with a quantitative approach as well. That's not to say that I'm arguing for it. It's simply that I think it's an interesting thing to think about. When these modified versions, you would be hard pressed to distinguish between analytic induction and some kinds of grounded theorizing, especially since what people actually do when they say they're using grounded theorizing is often rather different from what Glaser and Strauss say you should have done. So for me, the most important thing about analytic induction actually is the issues that it raises. It seems to me to generate some things that we need to think about. one of these is, what's the form of an adequate scientific explanation of a social phenomenon? What do we have to do if we're going to develop that? What kind of causal relations operate in the social world? And the final point is the one that I've already mentioned, which is the importance of revising the definition of the phenomenon. I think that fourth one is one that we really have to take on board and think about, because it's quite important almost whatever approach you're using. The other 3 points are issues where I'm not saying that what the advocates of analytic induction say, you should believe what they say. What I'm saying is you should note that there is a contrast and think about what the implications of the contrast are for how we do qualitative, or for that matter quantitative research. So the issue of what's the nature of causal relations, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. What you'd have to say about analytic induction is that it employs a very strong conception of causation. As I say, a notion of universal law, set of necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that must be met for some outcome to occur. And I think we have to think about whether that's an appropriate way of thinking about causation, about how we go about explaining things in the social world. Now, I don't know whether you have trouble getting your head around what the meaning of necessary and sufficient is, but I certainly do. So I've actually tried to spell this out. Necessary is what must be present for the outcome to occur, but the fact that thing is present doesn't mean that the outcome will occur. Sufficient means that anything that, if present, actually ensures that the outcome will occur, though it need not be present for the outcome to occur. And I've got another little diagram in a minute, which might or might not help you to understand that, which is based on the idea of a fire, that a necessary condition for a fire would be the presence of flammable materials. A sufficient condition, where there are flammable materials, would be a spark. But you can notice that there are flammable materials. Well, there are flammable materials in this room now, but fortunately we don't have a fire, but we've got the fire drill, so we're okay if it happens. A spark might occur without flammable materials, in which case there won't be any fire. And also fires can occur without sparks. They can occur in other sorts of ways. So that's a way of conceptualizing what the relationship is between necessary and sufficient conditions. Seems to me that that's a very strong, to say that what we have to produce is necessary is an account that identifies necessary and sufficient conditions. That's a very strong notion of causation, and I don't know whether that kind of causation operates in the social world. And we need to think about that. I don't think we need to assume that it doesn't. I think we just need to think about it. If we're going to investigate the social world, we have to think about, so what, if we're going to explain something, we're assuming that there are causal relations of some sort operating, but we need to think, well, what character do they have? And there are a number of other ways in which you can go about causal analysis. You can identify some significant sufficient condition, you can identify a significant necessary condition, or you can even just be identifying a condition that typically increases the chances of some outcome occurring. A lot of quantitative analysis falls into that third category, for example. It's interested in what increases the chances of an outcome. So in conclusion, I think analytic induction is an instructive model for thinking about causal analysis. I think it also is something that, if you're investigating certain types of topic, is a method that you could actually use. But I think it's restricted to particular sorts of topic. If you think about opiate addiction and financial trust violation, what you've got there are outcomes which are, as I said, quite specific and which are clearly the result of some sort of process that's gone on that's generated them. Analytic induction is quite good if that's the nature of your research problem. It's probably not very good if you have a different type of research problem. The other thing I'd say is that it illustrates that qualitative researchers have been and can be engaged in causal analysis. There is if you asked probably most qualitative researchers today, are they engaged in causal analysis, they'd probably say no. But whether they are or not depends on how you define causal analysis. And what I've been doing here is to say, well, if you define it in terms of the way that Znaniewski did, then it's almost certainly true that not only most qualitative researchers, but also most quantitative researchers don't engage in causal analysis because they don't set about trying to identify necessary and sufficient conditions. But if you define causation in a broader sense, in the way that I've just defined it a few minutes ago, like that, then I would say most qualitative researchers are engaged in it. And really the last point is just that I think it's worth thinking about because of the issues that it raises by offering a significant contrast to the way in which both qualitative researchers and quantitative researchers today generally go about their work.